Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Junhyung Kim, a Chancellor of Korea National Diplomatic Academy and the moderator for tonight's session. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the 2020 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. This year, due to COVID-19 pandemic, we are holding our conference online. We believe this may be the good opportunity to reach out to more global audiences. We have excellent panel tonight. I would like to thank all of our distinguished panelists and our online participants for taking your precious time to take part in our conference despite the inconvenient time differences. We hope today's conference will be a useful platform for renowned experts around the world to share their knowledge and wisdom under the theme of the post-pandemic world, reinventing multilateralism amidst geopolitical rivalries. So without further ado, let us proceed to begin our 2020 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. First of all, let me introduce to you our Foreign Minister, Kang Kyung-hwa of Republic of Korea for her keynote speech. With me, please welcome Minister Kang.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to join you for the 2020 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. I would like to express my sincere thanks to the acclaimed experts and scholars from Korea and abroad who are virtually gathered today to share their insights and outlooks on multilateralism in the post-pandemic world. The overarching theme of this year's conference is renewing multilateralism. This is an issue many of us have been grappling with for quite some time now, long before the outbreak of COVID-19. I've taken part in many bilateral and multilateral discussions on the issue in my current capacity, as well as in my previous job. I worked for a decade from early 2007 to mid-2017 as a senior official in the UN system, the universal organization that embodies full-blown multilateralism. Looking back, if I were to draw a line in that decade between the earlier period of pride and confidence in the system and the latter period of an increasing sense of inefficacy and frustration, I would do so somewhere in between late 2012 and mid-2013, when it became clear that the Security Council was incapable of rescuing Syria from plunging into full-blown civil war. Others at other front lines of multilateralism will remember different moments and different failures that have shaken their belief in the relevance of their work. But overall, there has been a general sense of self-doubt and soul-searching that has been settling in New York, Geneva, and other centers of multilateralism for many years. Beyond the immediacy of international organizations at work, the erosion of trust in multilateralism and the rules-based international order has had many manifestations and entry points for analysis. Increasing competition and clashes among the great powers within and outside multilateral settings. Selective engagement or disengagement with international institutions by member states. The spread of populism and nationalism in domestic politics, waning unity in regional organizations, and all of this in the midst of a crowded and toxic information environment that is increasingly detached from facts and commitment to seeking truth. Under the circumstance, the urgency of global action to tackle humanity's existential challenges, such as climate change and growing inequality, has been blunted and dulled. Since earlier this year, COVID-19 pandemic has further exposed the vulnerability of existing multilateral institutions and the global governance system. Countries turned insular and closed borders, driven by the urgent need to shield their own populations from the virus. the divisive member states' dynamics at the WHO in the aftermath of the outbreak undermined efforts to forge the much-needed global solidarity in tackling the crisis. Each of the elements that threatens multilateralism deserves a whole line of inquiry and discussion on its own. But what concerns foreign policy actors the most must be the rising tension between the big powers. What started in trade disputes has now escalated into a rivalry that encompasses a whole range of issues in economic, technology, military, security, political, and public health sectors. This downward spiral in superpower relations has been destabilizing for the multilateral organizations that have become an integral part of global governance. I can't think of any of my foreign minister colleagues, nor any head of an international organization who is not in search of clarity and the way forward under these uncertain times. Korea's approach is to shore up multilateralism and expand cooperation with no other goal than peace and co-prosperity with all others. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the global community has now reached a pivotal juncture in the struggle to save multilateralism. Either we each go our ways and let unilateralism take over, or we infuse new energy into multilateralism. Clearly, the answer is the latter. Indeed, COVID-19 has made clear how interdependent and vulnerable we are, and the urgency of multilateral action to overcome this pandemic and prepare for the next global health or other potentially devastating crisis. But we must be clear-eyed and realistic rather than merely aspirational in doing so. We're all coming to terms with the fact that we will not be able to return to life to the pre-COVID-19 days, for individuals as well as governments. I can't imagine close personal encounters and rubbing shoulders returning as a primary mode of diplomacy or any other human communication. At the UN, too, packed meeting rooms and hustled text negotiations are unlikely to return soon, if ever. But that is probably just the most visible aspect of what we can expect as we slowly but surely exit from pandemic. It is probably the easiest to act upon as well. There are harder issues stemming from older but less visible threats to multilateralism and tougher solutions to ponder. Against this backdrop, I would like to start at home, because our endeavors to shore up multilateralism needs to have full backing at home. Ladies and gentlemen, governments exist to serve the people. That should be a given in democracies, non-democracies, pseudo-democracies, or whatever kind of polity a country has. Looking around the world, however, the reality is deeply dismaying. Many states seem unable or unwilling, or both, to serve their peoples. The principle of government accountability is hard to abide by, even in the most vibrant democracies. Populism, bigotry, public impatience, and dwindling space to seek consensus in the midst of all the disparate forces makes it very difficult, sometimes seemingly impossible, for governments to deliver on their promises. But that is all the more the reason to try harder. And a good place to focus, as COVID-19 has compelled us to do, is public health. The mission of keeping people safe and secure from life-threatening, fast-traveling infectious diseases will not be done and over with COVID-19. As so many disease, ecology, and climate change experts warn, we must prepare for novel, unknown pathogens striking again. And as COVID-19 has made clear, with its death toll having surpassed 800,000 and still climbing, infectious disease and public health must be placed at the center of our thinking on security issues, along with other non-traditional security threats such as terrorism, cyber attacks, and I would add, infodemics. The key element in any crisis response is the trust between the protector and the protected, based on the core values that have taken root in society and codified in legal norms. In Korea, the government has worked hard to earn this trust in the COVID-19 response based on the values of openness, transparency, civic participation, and innovativeness. The recent resurgence in cases that started in the metropolitan Seoul region has the central and local governments on high alert. It has also been a painful reminder that civic participation cannot be expected of those with little trust in government or are against the government for one reason or another. We are humbled by the experience, and we are thus redoubling our efforts to convince them of the need to cooperate with government measures, while also mobilizing enforcement tools against stubborn non-cooperation. And while fighting COVID-19 inside the country, we know that it has to be defeated all around the world for Korea, for any country to be fully safe again against the virus or any other threats to human life that knows no borders. That is, unless one is resigned to accepting a future of no generalized cross-border human exchanges, and we clearly don't. And so, during the past months, Korea has been doing as much as we can to provide other countries with COVID-19 assistance, as well as to exchange experiences and learn from others. We have been actively initiating and participating in regional and global discussions to build health, economic, and political solidarity to overcome COVID-19 and its devastating fallout. In particular, we have been unwavering in our support of the WHO, with President Moon participating in the World Health Assembly as a keynote speaker. In turn, we have received WHO's steadfast support and repeated assurance that our COVID-19 response is on the right course. We will continue to support and actively contribute to the WHO, including in the efforts to make it stronger and more effective. The global health governance architecture needs to be strengthened and readied for the next global emergency by beefing up the capacity of the WHO and updating the international health regulations. In the immediate term, we are actively engaged in the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, Act A, which is a global mechanism built around the WHO and related global initiatives such as CEPI, Gavi, IVI, and others, with the political and financial support of donor and recipient governments. In particular, making COVID-19 vaccines a global public good, as President Moon and many others have called for, will be a crucial test in determining the level of global solidarity available to re-energize multilateralism. Some speak of an overhaul of the whole global governance built around the UN system. Indeed, reforming the UN is perhaps one of the most talked about topics around the world, but progress has been uneven. In particular, the Security Council, the entity that lies at the pinnacle of the UN system, has made little progress in reform, despite decades of efforts. To be realistic, it is hard to be hopeful that meaningful progress will be made on this topic in the foreseeable future, as the stakes are very high. So while the concerned member states, including Korea, continue to wrestle with one another on this strenuous challenge of finding a way to mitigate the fundamental democratic deficit in the UN system, more concerted and results-oriented efforts must be made to strengthen the less political, technical parts of the system, such as the WHO, to be more fit for current and future challenges. Here, too, big power rivalry is likely to come into play to a certain extent, but the space for middle powers with the capacity to contribute to the real work is wide and can be made even wider by joining forces. Beyond the lack of progress in Security Council reform, the international community's failure to prevent or end wars, to find peaceful solutions to conflicts, is a sobering reminder that what peace there is must be guarded and secured with peaceful means. This applies most acutely on the Korean Peninsula, where a fragile peace under an armistice has existed for nearly 7 decades. The Korean Peninsula peace process of my government seeks to turn this fragile peace into a permanent peace grounded on a formal peace accord that will replace the armistice. Getting North Korea to completely denuclearize is an integral part of this process. There have been ups and downs in the process during the past 3 years, and the dialogue with North Korea is currently stalled. But we are staying the course and determined to solidify the groundwork for the peace process to proceed slowly but surely. And we are doing so in close consultation with the United States and the neighboring countries, and firmly based on the solid combined defense posture of the ROK-US alliance. Distinguished guests, Korea owes much of its transformation from a war-devastated poor country into a prospering market economy and vibrant liberal democracy to the global multilateral order and the globalization that it has engendered. And so we are a model and committed advocate of their benefits. Our people have been well served by multilateral institutions. And now they're making their marks on the global stage with growing soft power in music and dance, dramas and movies, food and health. This is the product of a people whose creativity and innovativeness has been nurtured and unleashed by globalization. Our response to COVID-19 has also been driven by the people who demand openness, transparency, civic participation, and innovativeness in government action. We are thus firm believers in multilateralism and globalization, and we are joining our voice and capacity with others who share the same concern over the erosion of multilateralism. We have joined the Alliance for Multilateralism, which is an informal network of more than 50 countries that seek to shore up multilateral institutions. We have also launched friends groups in New York, Geneva, and Paris to support the endeavors of international organizations such as the UN, WHO, and UNESCO. We are also working in smaller groups such as MICTA to enrich the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations to be held at the UN in September. Ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 continues to evolve, stabilizing in many countries while resurging in others. No country is safe until we are all safe, unless the doors to cross-border people movement can remain closed forever. The ups and downs in our own countries, seen in the context of the global trend of the virus spread, points clearly to a prolonged period of humanity's struggle with the virus. Indeed, with each passing day and week, the end of the tunnel seems to be getting further and further away. COVID-19 broke out at a time of waning multilateralism and has even exacerbated it. But it has also jolted many countries into coordinated action. Who is to say where the world will be a year or two or a decade from now? But one thing is clear: all countries will be better off by then. All peoples will be safer and healthier by then, only if we use the time in between to work together around the global institutions that we have built for decades. The shape of what is to emerge in the process will likely be different from the present global governance setup. The prospect is exciting and disquieting at the same time, and Korea will remain a steady and committed player in the efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Kang, for your comment. Little alarming, but at the same time encouraging. As Minister Kang mentioned, I cannot agree more. that this is the opportune time to discuss how international community can cooperate and overcome the world crisis we are facing now. Now, the first session that we are about to begin will discuss multilateralism, how it can be renewed, revived, reinvented in the post-pandemic world. We'll first have a short presentation by our 5 panelists, which will be followed by discussions on the theme of the session. Let me first introduce to you briefly our panelists for this session, all renowned experts on the subject we are addressing today. First, Professor John Eikenberry, who will be the first speaker, is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University in the Department of Politics and Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He's the author of 7 books, the most recent one titled A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crisis of Global Order. In a recent survey of international relations scholars, he has been ranked the 10th in scholars who have produced the best work in the field of IR in the past 20 years. Very honored to have you here with us today. Next, our second speaker is Professor Choi Woo-sun, a faculty member of our KNDA, also currently serving as Director General of the Department of Security and Unification Studies. Prior to joining KNDA, he has taught at the School of American and International Studies at Ramapo College, New Jersey, after he got his PhD in political science from University of Chicago. He has conducted numerous research in the areas of international security, U.S.-China relations, U.S. foreign policies, and North Korea. I'm also very pleased to introduce to you our third speaker, Dr. Amitabh Acharya, Distinguished Professor at American University in Washington, D.C., also serving as UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance. He has written many books in the field of IR, including The Making of Global International Relations, Constructing Global Order, and The End of American World Order. I'm looking forward to his views on renewing multilateralism and the role of mid-power countries like South Korea. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Marty Natalegawa, former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Indonesia, and also former permanent representative of Indonesia to the UN. We are very honored to have you here with us today. Dr. Natalegawa is the author of the book, Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within, published in 2018, and currently a member of the UN Secretary General's high-level Advisory Board on Mediation and the Advisory Board on Disarmament. He has been cited as one of the most respected foreign policy and international security thinkers of his generation, both within Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, and in the broader Asia-Pacific region. Thank you for joining us today. Last but not least, let me introduce to you Dr. Tanya Barzell, Professor of Political Science and Chair for European Integration at the Otto Schur Institute of Political Science at the Free University of Berlin. Her recent publications include the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Regionalism, the Oxford Handbook of Governance in Areas of Limited Statehood, and the Governance Under Anarchy. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your views on multilateralism from the European perspective. Now that I have introduced all the speakers, let me briefly make some housekeeping announcements for proceeding the session. Since we are live streaming on YouTube, I would also like to invite all of our virtual audience to ask a question or make comments regarding the theme of this session. We will be checking your questions and comments so that they could be responded to by our speakers during the session. Each speaker will be given 7 minutes to deliver his or her presentation. I would like to ask our speakers to please try to keep to your allotted time. Now I would like to ask Professor John Eikenberry to present his views as our first speaker. Please welcome Professor Eikenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Kim, and it's a real honor to be here, to be on this panel and to be part of this conference. I also want to congratulate the foreign minister for her remarks, which I thought were both profound and inspiring, and allowing us to kind of have a sense of where we want this conversation today to go. I think we all agree that the 75-year-old multilateral system that emerged after World War II and it has been evolving over the last 7 or 8 decades is in crisis. In many ways, that's why we're here. The low point, I think, in that multilateral order may have been this past April, when in the midst of the greatest health crisis in the 20th century, really, and the greatest economic crisis of the post-war period, the G7 ministers meeting could not agree even on a communique about how to pursue collective action. It is emblematic of a wider problem I think we all are grappling with today across the world and across the various issue areas of economics, arms control, environmental concerns, human rights concerns. There seems to be a lost confidence around the world in collective solutions to common problems. In the short term, I think COVID is going to be exacerbating that problem, the decline of internationalism, the decline of multilateralism, strengthening populist nationalism, authoritarianism, zero-sum thinking. We're in it for our own purposes. Think about the likely politics of the after various serums are found for combating the pandemic virus. How collective will the sharing of those remedies be? I think we should be pessimistic about that. In my own memo, I try to argue that despite this moment of low ebb in multilateralism, like earlier eras, this is a moment when peoples and states around the world can lay the foundation for a new era of internationalism. And the starting point for me really is to think back historically at the 1930s, the last time when we were sort of at this kind of moment where liberal democracies were in retreat, multilateralism was in decline, the world economy had collapsed. Yet at that moment when everybody saw the breakdown of order, the end of multilateralism, there was an undercurrent of renewal, green shoots, an effort to put the pieces back together, beginning really in the period of World War II and afterwards. And thinking about how the problems that the states were entering into could be confronted with a new framework of cooperation. All of it coming from a conviction that, like this COVID pandemic, we are always safer together than we are alone, that we can only secure our public health and our way of life if we work together. Let me make 3 brief points about how to perhaps I would envisage this next era of rebuilding multilateralism, talking about the success of the old order, talking about what went wrong, and then mentioning a few ideas about how we might proceed. I think the first step that is useful, at least for Americans who are trying to reinvigorate an American approach to multilateralism, is to go back and try to recall what worked in the past. And the liberal international spirit, which animated the last 7 or 8 decades, has obviously come in for hard times. Different speakers have found different moments when this order has been seen to be less than effective. The 2008 financial crisis is one moment when the United States and its partners seem to perform very poorly. The Iraq War even has been seen as a kind of failure of internationalism. But it's worth remembering that there is a foundation, however tattered it may be today, of multilateral cooperation built around decades of trial and error, built around the liberal democratic states, with the United States playing an important role, building multilateral institutions and partnerships across economic, political, and security affairs, regional and global institutions, bargains, partnerships, alliances, shared values, and a shared sense of strategic interest. All of this under the weight of a set of convictions that we have about why multilateralism is good. And I think there are 4 convictions that have driven the last 7 decades of multilateralism. One is that trade and exchange between societies on balance is better than the opposite, that multilateral cooperation and multilateral institutions facilitate cooperation. Thirdly, that liberal democracies have a special capacity to work together with shared values and habits of cooperation. And finally, that rising economic and security interdependence requires more rather than less multilateralism. And under these convictions that have been playing out over the last 6 or 7 decades, there have been a great number of successes that we shouldn't simply ignore or assume don't exist. One is that we have found ways to open the world economy after collapse of economies, after World War II, providing mechanisms for multilateral reciprocal exchange and tariff reductions. We created a framework for which Germany and Japan could be brought into a fold of partnership after being, in effect, the enemies of this stable international order, allowing those 2 countries to redefine themselves as great powers away from their authoritarian fascist period and bringing them into a liberal democratic world where they found a way to re-identify themselves as civilian great powers without nuclear weapons. Germany and France found a way to reorganize themselves, to bury old hatreds, and launch the project of the European Union that I think we'll hear more about. And then trilateral cooperation found its golden era with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO. And then finally, the 5th, I guess, accomplishment of this multilateral order has been the kind of system of a kind of world system of integration that has allowed for new democracies, the most important of which perhaps is South Korea, in making transitions to market economy and to liberal democracy, and to find a platform for not just advancing its own interest inside of this system, but to increasingly play a role in this system. So that's my first point. Remember the accomplishments and build on them, don't reject them. Secondly, very briefly, what went wrong? And I'll just say very quickly that in some sense we probably went too far, that after the Cold War ended, this liberal order of multilateralism expanded, this order that was really built inside of a bipolar system between the superpowers during the Cold War. That order, in some sense, was a bridge too far. It didn't reform itself sufficiently, integrate new states sufficiently. And so the inside order, the liberal order for 45 years, became the outside order. There was no other organizing principle available. And that sense of responsibility that these states who are inside this multilateral system are not just takers of benefits, but are responsible states that are required to contribute public goods and be part of the system, failed to take hold. And so the liberal international order that for 45 or 50 years looked like a club of organized around democracies that had rights and responsibilities became more like a shopping mall where you could wander in and gain some benefits, but not buy into a whole suite of responsibilities and obligations that meant that if you're going to get the benefits of being inside of this multilateral order, you need to be part of the patrons who take care of it. Finally, let me just briefly say a few things about how we might proceed. And I know my colleagues will have even more to say about this, but it seems to me that we need to return to basics. We need to return to those convictions I mentioned earlier about why we are here, why we care about building the next era of multilateralism. And three recommendations, very broad, that I think are important. One is, I do think we need to reconstitute ourselves as a grouping of states that are dedicated to a kind of liberal international orientation. I do think that the liberal democracies have a special relationship and a special obligation. I've argued that we might think of this as a D10 organization, which would include the old G7, but also other liberal democracies, maybe D12. There are lots of countries from the old Western system and from the new democratic world that would be part of this to drive the agenda of rebuilding the trade system and rebuilding the security system. Secondly, we need to reframe what we think about when we think about interdependence and globalization. Globalization has both things that are good and things that are bad. It has great benefits, but also great dangers. And one of the ways in which we can rebuild the argument in favor of internationalism rather than just simply nationalism is to remember that we're not in favor in the abstract of more globalization, that the multilateral system and internationalism of the last 70 years has not been about reducing borders so much as managing our interdependence, which is different. It means that we're about trying to develop a system that makes us more secure, to create a kind of international protective system that doesn't get rid of interdependence, but creates mechanisms so we can manage it. And then finally, I do think that we need to play what I would call a two-level game. In one of the levels, the liberal democracies do need to work together. They do have special interests, human rights, labor standards, social democratic values that we've worked on for over half a century, and we don't want to give those up as we move into the wider world. The liberal democracies do have special reasons to cooperate, but we also live in a global world where we need everybody working together. And that's the second level. That's what we call the Westphalian level. That's the United Nations. That's where we invite everybody, regardless of their type of political system, to work together. That kind of second level also is important, and it's also worked in the past, even during the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States worked together in the WHO, of all places, to find a response to smallpox. There are lots of cases where we can reach across the democratic and the non-democratic divide. But I would just simply say that in a kind of general sort of mood of optimism, that even at the darkest moment of the international system, and maybe even precisely because of we're at such a dark moment where we can see over the abyss, we can see what will certainly happen if we don't reform and begin a multilateral reconstruction movement, what will happen. And I'll just end by saying we have been here before. And in the American case, the United States began as 13 colonies who declared their independence from an empire called the British Empire in 1776. And Benjamin Franklin, one of the delegates to the convention, on that day, on July 4th, 1776, said to his 13 colonies, we will need to hang together or we will surely hang separately. And I think that spirit of over 250 years ago is still with us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Eikenberry, for sharing with us your enlightening views. And I especially impressed that you mentioned about that we need to have a conviction that the multilateralism will work, even if we're in disarray. And always multilateralism comes around with trials and errors. And again, I think it's, distinguished panelists need more than 7 minutes. We want more minutes to listen to your presentation, but we have a limited time and we want to have more discussions afterwards. So please keep that in mind and try to keep to the allotted time. And next, I would like to invite Professor Cho-sun from KNDA to present his views.
Thank you. I'm also honored to be here. Multilateralism had already been declining even before COVID-19 spread. I think there are two main factors that explain the decline of multilateralism. The first factor is the changing distribution of power. The predominant position of the United States has been weakened over the past decades as China rose as a near-peer competitor. I think that the decline of multilateralism has been strongly related with the declining position of the United States. And the future of multilateralism and international order will primarily depend on the global distribution of power. Another factor that has made strong negative effects on multilateralism in recent years is Trump's unilateralism and his amendment of international leadership. I think this political factor can possibly be reversed by the result of the upcoming US presidential election. To better understand how multilateralism has evolved, I think that we need to distinguish three realms of multilateralism. They have different dynamics. In security realm, the realist international order has persisted. During the Cold War, power politics surely dominated the world. Even after the Cold War, realism, not liberal values, has been the main driver behind the cooperation among the United States and its liberal allies, as well as the increasing competition between the United States and China. In this security realm, multilateral cooperation is inherently difficult for fear and cheating problem, except alliance based on the converging strategic interests. So compared to economic realm, multilateral security cooperation has been more limited. In recent years, the US-China rivalry has further strained the multilateral cooperation in arms control, nuclear proliferation, regional institution building in Asia, etc. I think that there are greater possibilities of multilateral cooperation and institutionalization in economic realm. States are not very sensitive to relative gains in economic transactions, except in the case in which intense rivalry exists. After World War II, a liberal economic order was established in the West under the leadership of the United States. Although there are another bloc led by the Soviets, it greatly contributed to prosperity of many countries. The liberal economic order was expanded to a global one under the US leadership following the Cold War. But while it became global, multilateral economic cooperation has faced obstacles. The rise of China and the increasing voice of the developing countries have made it increasingly difficult for major powers to agree on a reform of the WTO, leading to an impasse. Further, hyperglobalization facilitated by multilateral institutions caused loss of jobs and inequality even in the leading countries. Exploiting those negative aspects of globalization, Trump took power, and his unilateralism has further weakened multilateral economic cooperation. Thirdly, multilateral cooperation has been developed to solve problems of global commons, as the world became highly interconnected. Until recently, despite the competition between the United States and China, multilateral cooperation had increased to deal with climate change, public health, terrorism, nuclear security, etc. However, Trump's policies and his abandonment of leadership role has seriously weakened multilateral cooperation on global issues such as climate change and public health, while creating bad atmosphere for other cooperation. Now I would like to turn to my prediction of the future of multilateralism. In the short run, I think that the result of the US presidential election will make important impact on multilateralism. And I think that COVID-19 can influence multilateralism in important ways by increasing the chance for Biden. Anyway, if Trump is re-elected, despite the difficulties caused by the COVID-19, multilateralism will further suffer from the lack of global leadership and a greater antagonism between the United States and China. If Biden is elected, I think that the new administration will stabilize the relationship with China, although it will continue to gradually step up its balancing of China, especially in military and technology areas. China will reciprocate. On the other hand, Biden will make efforts to restore U.S. leadership. I think that these efforts can restore U.S. leadership to some extent. Nevertheless, the new administration will probably face stiff resistance from China in reforming WTO. This, I think, that as alternatives is likely to resuscitate the initiatives to build the CPTPP and TTIP as regional trade architecture. And I think that if Biden is elected, he will make greater efforts to lead collective actions in issues such as climate change, pandemics, and non-proliferation. And the rise of China and the changing distribution of power will make great long-term effects on multilateralism. I think that the world will be transformed to multipolarity in which the United States and China would become first-tier great powers. The growing competition between the United States and China has already become an irreversible trend as a result of the changing balance. From a long historic view, the US and China are entering into the early stage of their honest strategic competition. However, under the US superiority, I think China doesn't want an honest arms race yet. Currently, the US also wants stability in Asia for good strategic reasons. Nonetheless, I think that a new Cold War is possible after the mid-2030s. China will possibly overtake the United States in economic size by that time, and China will possibly be ready to militarily challenge the United States for strengthening its security, as it will acquire substantial power projection capabilities and sophisticated battle network. If China tries to dominate Asia, I think US is likely to contain it in cooperation with its allies. As the US-China rivalry intensifies, multilateral security cooperation will be increasingly strained. In Asia, multilateral security institutions can contribute to building confidence and managing crisis. But considering the US-China rivalry, nationalism, and diverse interests, multilateral security institutions will be largely stagnated in Asia, except alliance cooperation. And the US-China rivalry will make it difficult to reform the WTO or to build a new global trade institution. In this stalemate, I think it is likely that regional economic institutions led by the US and China will compete in Asia, while many members will still overlap. And a gradual decoupling will likely occur, starting from technology area, although a complete decoupling is not likely because of the lack of political and allied support. If a new Cold War ensues in the future, I think world order will be a realist order. Multilateral security and economic cooperation will be largely divided into blocks, as security considerations will dominate. Nonetheless, some level of economic interdependence and cooperation might be sustained, and I think that it is possible that multilateral cooperation to solve practical issues such as climate change, pandemics, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism will survive, based on the necessity of collective actions in the interconnected world. We should afford multilateral cooperation as far as possible. Nonetheless, I think that we need to keep a realistic view about what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Cho for your penetrating remarks, especially from the perspective of geopolitical rivalries. He's known as a realist here, and he showed much different, contrasting views than the Professor Eikenberry. I think it's really we're expecting that the response from Professor Eikenberry. And now let me give the floor to the Professor Amitav Acharya from American University. Please go ahead, Professor Acharya.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you, and a special thanks to hello to my international speaking colleagues here. God knows when we will meet in person again. So at least it's great to see all of you, at least virtually. So I will make 4 quick points and one concluding remark in my 7 minutes. I hope I will stick to that. My first point is that the crisis of the multilateral system is not new. And this is a point already made by several speakers, but I think it's pre-COVID, it's actually pre-Trump. And it has been the brewing for a long time. And we can go back and look at it, 2008, 2003, the Iraq invasion by US. But we can also see it as an evolutionary decline of the post-war international order, simply because of structural changes, which means the rise of the rest, the rise of not only countries like China or India, but also of generally of a whole variety of regional actors around the world. So the global power shift is well documented, and in keeping with that, the existing multilateral system since World War II, which was based on a certain type of distribution of power and ideas, has to change. And but let me tell you some basic truths about post-war multilateralism. We all know this, but we often forget that. One truth is that multilateralism is never really universally appealing to every leader. It's not a good thing. It's not seen as a good thing by every leader. President Sukarno took Indonesia out of UN briefly. George W. Bush was hardly a supporter of the liberal international order. So not every leader likes multilateralism. And it's not a good thing for a lot of leaders through history. Secondly, I would like to say that demand for multilateralism beyond the leadership is never linear. It rises and falls. So we have had moments of multilateralism, strong support for multilateralism, like after World War II, and also after the end of the Cold War. But also we have then have crisis of multilateralism in different phases. So it's never a linear thing. The third thing is, and this is a bit of a good news, the demand for multilateralism is much more broad-based than ever before. So we are talking about multilateralism, both of states and non-state actors. And there have been far more non-state actors that have entered the international system since World War II. And most of them, I'm not talking about groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but I'm talking about civil society and NGOs. And the overwhelming majority of these NGOs and transnational social movements are pro-multilateral. They may not like the UN system per se, but they want multilateralism as the organizing principle of the international system. And that's why the state-based multilateral system, which the UN represents more or less, is under crisis. But that doesn't mean multilateralism as the organizing principle of the international order is getting less and less support, notwithstanding populism. And finally, on this truth about multilateralism, it's both due to short-term and long-term factors. I talked about long-term factors like global shift in power and also the proliferation of new actors which are demanding their own space within the state-centric multilateral system or beyond the state-centric multilateral system. But there are also new developments which I consider are relatively new, short-term developments. I consider them short-term. I consider populism as short-term. Again, democracy doesn't go in, it's not a linear thing. It goes in waves of rise and fall of appeal of democracy. And similarly, the kind of domestic politics we see in the US is also never going to be considered as a permanent thing. It's a short-term thing, and those are really important. The power rivalry, which is another challenge to multilateralism, is also not necessarily long-term. We have had many fluctuations in the relations among the major powers throughout history. So therefore, we should not think of the crisis of multilateralism as a sudden, new, unexpected, and irreversible. Having said that, COVID is still new. We don't know how the world order will evolve, and we should probably reserve our judgments, whether it's the more pessimistic or more optimistic scenario at least for a little while longer. Let me just move to a second point, which is the China challenge. And I don't have much time to deal with this, but a lot of concern has been raised about how China is capturing global multilateral institutions. China now leads 4 of the 15 UN specialized agencies. But that's, to me, a bit exaggerated because, multilateralism, the Chinese engagement in multilateralism is I think, it's generally a very good thing, even in Chinese leadership, because it constrains China. As John, I can would agree, multilateral institutions have a binding function. And having China within a multilateral system is actually, to me, a good thing. And the world is not going to be captured by Chinese ideas and ideologies about taking multilateralism in a different direction. There is a lot of pushback. There could be a lot of more pushback if China really tried to capture multilateral system. On the other hand, I think it's a good thing that China is showing more interest and putting more resources into multilateralism. The third point is regionalism, which is a very important part of multilateralism. And we have all talked about this. Tanya and I have written extensively about it. But I would like to say that regionalism provides an opportunity to overcome some of the difficulties multilateralism is facing after COVID-19. The European Union is a good example, although initially its reaction was not fantastic, but it has really picked up and provides a hope that regionalism can actually help to manage global challenges. And I think ASEAN has done not too bad. And I think African Union, I think we should be looking at this complementary role, if not competitive role, of regional organizations in addressing providing multilateral solutions to global problems. Finally, we should not think of, I think I'm a little uncomfortable when people talk about reviving, regenerating multilateralism. I would like to say moving forward rather than reviving something. So I have argued that the liberal international order will not disappear completely, but it will never really come back, especially as a liberal hegemony, the hegemonic order. It will remain one of the elements of that order, of the overall global order. And how important and how central remains to be seen. That can depend on how the liberal democracies organize themselves. But I would like to say that we are moving into something what I call G+, not a G0, not a G7, not a G20 world. G+ to me means 2 things. And I've written again about this, and I can explain later. One is that no single power or group of powers, whether it's a liberal democracies or G20, can lead global cooperation. Second, no single power or no group of powers can lead in every area, every issue area. So there will be some sort of a functional division of labor, maybe between security, economics, climate, and other fields. So G+ also brings in a lot more actors rather than G2 or G20 or G7. I think we should be looking at that. And if we look at this, we'll find that there are new opportunities for multilateralism opening up. And Minister Kang talked about some of those initiatives, including like MICTA grouping, but also at the global level. I think what we should be looking at is create and emphasize these groups. One advantage of doing that is that it will put pressure on the P5, which is hopelessly outdated, to actually get their act together or be less and less relevant. So I would like to champion that we should actually explore new groups which can strengthen the multilateral system rather than rely on the old UN system. And in that sense, we should make multilateralism less ideological, more functional and less ideological. And John talked about 2 levels of multilateralism, and I think it's a good idea, but we should integrate those 2 levels. Now, if you create a liberal democracy group as a driver of multilateralism and give it too much prominence, it's going to alienate countries like China. It may even alienate countries like Russia. It may even alienate democracies like India or Indonesia, who do not like this kind of club of the West, as John put it, and I actually coined the term liberal order as a club of the West. I don't think we need that. We need more integration, and the way to integrate that is to be less ideological and more functional. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for valuable insight, Professor Acharya. I think maybe the audience, you can notice that Professor Acharya is kind of in between the views of Chosun and Dr. Eikenberry. And it's really impressive that he talked about that this multilateralism has ups and downs. So it's a mixed, never linear. And he's a champion of this concept of multiplex. And he talked about how we integrate the different levels of multilateralism. And I think we have a lot of questions and interesting topics to be debated later on. And next, I would like to give the floor to Marty Natalegawa, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Minister Natalegawa, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity given to me to share some of my thoughts. Clearly, one always risks oversimplification when one tries to sum up some complex ideas within a 7-minute time frame. With that kind of footnote or disclaimer, I should like to share some of my thoughts, if I may be permitted. I think the COVID-19 challenge has given another opportunity for leaders all around the world to reaffirm their professed commitment to multilateralism. I think it's extremely rare to find any leader who would stand up and say they are against multilateralism. They're extremely eloquent, extremely able to describe why it is that the COVID-19 challenge constitutes a litmus test for multilateralism, why it is that more than ever there is a need to renew, to reinvent, to strengthen the multilateral approach, whether it be because the COVID reminds that this is a classic case where we have a problem, a challenge that defies national solution and demands instead international cooperation, or whether in terms of impact, given the multifaceted nature of the consequence of the COVID-19. In other words, I think everyone is now speaking on the need for multilateralism and extremely eloquent and able in describing why that is so urgently needed. But I think at the same time, as such commitments are constantly being made, one can't help but notice there is increasingly a credibility gap between what's been said in terms of commitment, in terms of avowed goals, or in terms of intent, and the reality. And I think the reality is people are also extremely capable and adept in describing, and we heard this morning, earlier today, the minister describing it in such a important and a comprehensive and yet succinct manner that we are seeing a completely different picture. We are seeing multilateral institutions, multilateralism under stress, marginalized, adrift, irrelevant, even arguably, a situation where we are devoid of any indication of leadership. Instead, we are seeing a world marked by divisions, by unilateralism. I think this gap between intent and declaration of intent and commitment and the reality is not healthy for multilateralism, because it raises questions of credibility. The gap is too wide. It's becoming a huge division between perception and reality. And here, we, at the risk of oversimplification, I believe we are suffering through twin deficits. One is the leadership deficit. Countries are so ready to self-anoint or self-appoint themselves as the guardian of the international order, however one would like to label it, in terms of describing themselves as major power, as great power, but they don't wish to shoulder or demonstrate the responsibility that comes with that status. They claim to be major, they claim to be great powers, and yet their behavior are far from it. And of course now, the latest evidence we are seeing is the geopolitical divisions and rivalries between the United States and China, whether it be initially marked by competitive dynamics that's now increasingly becoming more confrontational in many multilateral forums. But it is not uniquely US-China. Because in the past and during the Cold War, we've had the previous manifestation of US-Soviet Cold War rivalry that really undermine multilateral efforts. The series of vetoes that the UN Security Council experienced during that time is well recorded. But the point that I wanted to emphasize is that while what is needed is cooperative partnership, we are seeing the exact opposite. Countries that we try to rely on to demonstrate leadership in accordance with their self-proclaimed, self-anointed great power status, guardian of the order, however one defined it, are not demonstrating precisely that kind of leadership. But I think, truth be told, the malaise or the source of the problem is not only among the major powers. If it was, then perhaps we can sort of contain it, manage it, and have some kind of modalities that somehow circumvent that reality of trust deficit between the major powers, so-called major powers. But I think the malaise is deeper than that. Because when you talk about multilateralism, isn't that about a way of an outlook, a belief in such an approach? It's not only about multilateral institutions. And here I think, if we are honest, we have been seeing for many years, even prior to COVID, increasing trust deficit, both interstate and deficit of trust and confidence and belief in multilateral approach and multilateral institutions. One of them, many of us have mentioned before, I think at the national level, increasingly, and this is not uniquely US, China, but increasingly mainstream, there is inclination towards a more country-first, zero-sum transactional approach with little room for the more painstaking and sometimes slow and deliberate multilateral process that is inherent in any multilateral approach. Instead, we are seeing at many capitals a sense of haste in wanting to deliver quickly. Electoral cycle becomes the defining time frame rather than the nature of the problem in general. So governments, peoples and countries tend to be increasingly unilateral in their outlook, national rather than multilateral. And working methods and procedure associated with multilateral approach is seen to be archaic, seen to be bureaucratic, seems to be, there is a sense of impatience in the way multilateralism works. But I think it's not only trust deficit or deficit in confidence and on multilateral approach, but also there is a sense of exasperation on the representativeness of multilateral organizations. I mean, I've been at the UN for working for Indonesia at the UN for a number of years and in different capacities. But, while one speaks of sovereign equality among nations, in reality, there are countries who profess and who feel that they are more than others in terms of the way the UN system works. And I think there is a sense of exasperation that the system, that the multilateral system institutions as currently organized doesn't reflect the situation of the world today. Earlier, Professor Acharya mentioned about Indonesia withdrawing from the UN during President Sukarno's time, the only country that actually withdrew from the UN. But if I'm not mistaken, in my historical recollection, the motivation was less to do with non-support for multilateral approach, but the driving force sentiment was there was a feeling that the UN even then was seen to be for the established, so-called established forces. So there was an urgency and wish to create so-called new emerging forces, because the UN, even in 1960s, was seen to be not in keeping with the dynamic of the time. Hence the exasperation, and hence we left and then came back again. But I think this degree, the question of representativeness becomes an extremely debilitating one on multilateralism. And I think, and my final point on this, to emphasize, it's not only major power dynamics. I think there is one issue that does not often acknowledge openly. While all of us, countries, speaks of the importance of multilateralism, when it comes to their own issues, countries are extremely reticent to have their issue brought to the multilateral forum. Because they feel that their national bilateral issues are being multilateralized. And hence, whenever the UN come in, especially in a preventive conflict prevention mode, countries becomes extremely sensitive, extremely unwilling to allow the United Nations, the multilateral approach, to become operational. In other words, I feel that while countries are very eloquent in speaking the need for multilateralism for others, but when it comes to their own immediate interests, multilateralism is not really on the card. I think this must be acknowledged as a deficit, as a problem area, so that we can really dissect why is it that countries are unwilling to open the doors for greater multilateral interest and engagement on some of their most sensitive areas. My final thoughts, if I may, I'm aware of the limitation of time. Then the question of renewal or reinvention of multilateral approach. And I think all of us are keenly aware that there's been so many efforts at reform, whether reform of the UN Security Council, revitalization of the General Assembly, of the ECOSOC, of all the various bits and pieces of the UN and of the Bretton Woods systems. But all of them have basically grind to a halt. I don't believe this piecemeal type of reform efforts is going to go anywhere fast. Now thanks to COVID, there is a renewed sense of urgency, but I'm sure once the memory of the pandemic challenge is behind us, then everyone will go back to their business as usual approach. And especially the resident power, the countries that are the principal beneficiary or enjoy greater status within the current system will be the last to want to begin to self-dissolve their special role. This is clearly in the UN Security Council, but the special status countries enjoy as permanent member of the UN Security Council has ramifications beyond the Security Council. In the various UN system family, the P5 footprint is felt widely. And I don't think at any time soon we can see a willingness by countries who are enjoying such prominence to sort of abdicate those kind of responsibilities and special status. Hence, for that reason as well, I am not a great supporter of the idea of having a reform simply to snapshot the current constellation of power today. Whatever the term you use, whether it's emerging power, middle power, I know that some people are so keen in this terminology, but I am of the view that power is dynamic, is constantly changing, evolving, and situation specific. As soon as one reform international organization or multilateral institutions to reflect the status of the world as of that time, it will become obsolete almost the next day, because things change. And the countries that have been so reformist in their outlook, so progressive, once they enjoy the trappings of power, the trappings of spatial status, especially as permanent member of the UN Security Council, I can guarantee you their behavior will not be any bit that different to the current existing established power. Hence, I believe that rather than tinkering with membership of this group, creating new group, whether it be D10, D17, whatever it is, I think we need to think anew. We need to think afresh. I know we have all this paraphernalia and institutions that we have, fine, we'll work on, we'll continue to invest in them. But at the same time, people who have the capacity and the freedom to think outside the box, those who are in that position should imagine a blank page. Think a Bretton Woods moment, a San Francisco moment. If we are to start from scratch to create new institutions, new modalities, how would it look like? What is the definition of inclusion, inclusive multilateralism? Is it simply more countries, or is it non-state actors? Is it driven by issues? Because on every issue, there are different constellations. The parties necessarily to involve is not only states, but there's the other stakeholders. I feel that what we are seeing now, we are seeing a gap between 20th century institutions dealing with 21st century problems. And it cannot be tinkered. You can simply tinker here and there, but the fundamental gap still exists. And my final point, I believe that ultimately multilateralism must address two types of nexus. One is the nexus of levels, local, national, regional, and global multilateral. They are not either or. At the moment, it's as if we are down the road of saying it's either national or multilateral, unilateral or multilateral, unilateral, bilateral, regional, or multilateral. But they are all one at the same time. Most of the problems of multilateral cooperation has at its root bilateral dynamics, US-China and US-Russia, cross-Atlantic. So I think there has to be a new way of looking at things where these levels are seen to be synergic. They are not either or. There is not between national, country first, bilateral, regional, or multilateral, global. It has to be one holistic approach. And my final point is on the issues. I think, traditionally we define issues of peace and security, on development issues, on human rights issues, but all these issues are intertwined and interconnected. And we have to begin with that recognition. But I am freed from thinking in a standardized manner, in a conventional manner. I would like to challenge those who are thought leaders to try to step back and imagine they are at a Bretton Woods moment, imagine they are at a San Francisco moment, and think, how would they devise a new multilateralism if you will start from scratch? I think that is what is needed, rather than simply tinkering around the edges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Natalegawa. And you talked about the several challenges we are facing now. It's the first, credibility issues. That what's been said is totally different from what's been done. And domestic politics will hinder again. And it's impressive that you talked about that reforming and developing, current international organization is not a good idea because always lagging behind. And finally, you talked about, the same thing is a linkage point between the local, regional, and universal. And then above all, we need to more creatively think that from the scratch. And I would like to move on to our last speakers, Professor Tanya Barzell from the Free University of Berlin. Professor Barzell, it's waited a long time. Sorry for that. Sorry about that. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much, and good morning from the beautiful state of Wyoming. It's the US state which mostly supported Donald Trump in the 2016 election. It is a true pleasure to participate in the discussion about the future of multilateralism. It's always a challenge to go last, particularly in a panel with such distinguished speakers. So in the interest of time, I try not to repeat what has already been said, and I think there are many points in which we agree, but we'll focus on two questions pertaining to the future of multilateralism, where I see some room for discussion. One is the role of leadership, and the other is the role of liberalism or liberal democracy. So, and I try to stick to my 7 minutes. I think we all agree that a major challenge, if not the major challenge for multilateralism at the moment, are the tensions or the competition between US and China. The point I want to highlight here, that this competition is not only about a geopolitical rivalry, but I also think it involves competing, or at least alternative visions for the international order. The US and China both pursue approaches to the international order, to multilateralism, that are somewhat rooted in their domestic models or scripts for organizing society. And interestingly enough, none of the two approaches, or both approaches, challenge the rule-based multilateral international order that has characterized our time after the Second World War. The US is increasingly withdrawing to what one may call national unilateralism. China claims to endorse rule-based multilateralism, but seeks to roll back the liberal social purpose of the multilateral order. That, I mean, I agree with John that there are two levels, but I would argue that the multilateralism after the end of the Second World War, and even more so after the end of the Cold War, has a liberal social purpose. And China is clearly seeking to roll that back. And at the same time, its practices, its bilateralism, but also its aggressive unilateralism, particularly in the South China Sea, cast some serious doubt to what extent China can be counted on as a responsible stakeholder, not to mention an international leader on which multilateralism will be able to rely on. And that brings me to my first question. How important is international leadership by a power in order to maintain a multilateral international order? And I just want to remind us that we had about more than almost 50 years ago, we had a discussion already about hegemonic decline, right, of the US, and whether the post-Second World War order could survive without US hegemony. There's this famous book by Bob Cohen, After Hegemony. And I think in the international relations, the conclusion was that multilateral institutions can exist and persevere if there is a significant number of countries that recognize that they share common interests and create institutions that allow them to pursue these common interests. And I think it is important also to look at, as Amitabh Acharya pointed out, at the experience of regionalism as successful forms of multilateralism that have emerged and thrived without, and sometimes even despite, a hegemon. right? So I want to caution us a little bit not to overemphasize the importance of a great power that is necessary to sustain or to create and sustain multilateral international institutions, also because it is very convenient for countries like my own Germany or the European countries to shirk responsibility for multilateralism by always pointing to the need for the strong power that needs to engage in order to make multilateralism work. Now, it has already been mentioned, the European Union is a strong case of regional multilateralism that arguably has thrived without a clear hegemon. We can talk about a number of countries that have worked together to make European integration work, but clearly there is not one overpowering hegemon in the European Union. And the European Union has been quite successful in ensuring peace, security, and prosperity, and also in providing effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic consequences. Yet, as I argue in my memo, the internal unity of the European Union is very unlikely, despite its own ambition to translate into some international leadership to reinvent or to strengthen multilateralism. I don't have time to go into the reasons, but I'm curious to hear how others perceive that. But the European Union has been very inward-looking for the past, I would say, at least 10 years. And that has, of course, to do with the multiple crises the European Union had to face and has withered quite well. But I mean, that as a result of which it has very much concentrated its resources, focusing on its own internal problems. So there is very little hope for the EU, to provide strong international leadership, despite, again, its own ambitions for playing a more active role. Now, this brings me to the second question I would like to raise, namely the question, how important are democracies for the multilateral international order? I think it's John Eikenberry who has argued that democracies are important for the post-Second World War liberal international order, as much as the liberal international order has been important for these liberal democracies to thrive. So the question is, to what extent the two levels Eikenberry talks about are mutual constitutive, i.e. need each other, right? And I think this is a really tricky question. Because the liberal social purpose of multilateralism is not only contested by non-liberal countries such as China or Russia, it is increasingly contested within liberal democracies by populisms on both sides of the political spectrum, left and right. And I just want to remind you of something that Minister Kang has said. Shoring up multilateralism starts at home. So we need to come to terms that multilateralism is not only contested by certain states, but also within our own countries. So the question then is, what are we going to do, right? How do we reimagine multilateralism? And I want to conclude by pointing to a tension between the liberal social purpose of the rule-based multilateral international order that was created after the end of the Second World War, on the one hand, and the pluralism that is inherent in liberalism, right? And I think we, as important as liberal democracies may be in order to sustain the rule-based multilateral order, I think we need to remind ourselves, and this has been said before, that not everybody shares our liberal script for organizing societies. And one way to negotiate this tension between the universalism of liberal values on the one hand and the pluralism that is inherent to these liberal values is that we join forces in making multilateral more inclusive. And I think this is more than simply tinkering with the edges or it involves particularly giving the global south, not so much China. China is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Inclusiveness is much broader. It needs to give countries from the global south in particular a greater voice. And that is not a trivial thing, right? And I just want to conclude by pointing again to something that Amitabh Acharya in particular has emphasized, the role of regionalism as not as a stepping stone, as an important cornerstone for strengthening multilateralism at the regional level, at the global level, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Barzell. And actually, we have only 30 minutes left. I don't know how to manage this discussion sessions. I thought a lot during the presentations. I think let me do this way, actually. Let me raise general questions on the one hand, and the more specific questions to the specific panelist. So you can pick it up what you want, but you have to explain the questions toward you. I have a lot of questions from audience, but I have to merge into the whole total questions. I think so far one big debate is arising, which is whether to rebuild from scratch is better or reform what is already there. I think it's the one general questions. And second question is the option of regionalism can replace and can be a good alternative to this crisis of multilateralism in a universal way. So at that question, maybe especially can be answered by 2 regional specialists, Barzell and Natalia. And another question is I actually addressed to you by mail. My question is, it's about Korea. Actually, I don't want to be lead you to be compliment about Korea's doing about COVID, but I think it is important, Korean case, because in terms of reshaping and renewing multilateralism in the world after COVID, because despite the recent resurgence in cases that started in the metropolitan Seoul, our government is doing okay, I think. So-called K-disease control. What is the implication in terms of multilateralism? Because we never had a lockdown or principle of democracy, transparency, and openness. We are having a hard time, but we still try to keep this principle. So please, what's the implication, and comment on the implication of Korea's role? And in addition to that, actually, as Minister Kang talked about MICTA, all the time in the past, actually, we are trying to gather similar-sized country, not need-based or issue-oriented cooperation. But these days, I find some kind of issue-oriented the cooperation, let's say, between Germany and Korea, France and Korea, and Australia and Korea, and New Zealand and Korea. So this kind of bottom-up kind of multilateral and issue-based can be a solution too. These are the 3 general questions. And the next one is, specific question to specific guest. Number 1 is for asking Professor Barzell and Natalia. And the same one is it really ASEAN way can be the model for other region too, Professor Barzell talked about successful cases of the Europe, and that can be a model to other region. And to Professor Eichenberg and Professor Che, so many audiences ask about the Trump effect. Okay, would it make difference? I definitely yes. I expect difference, but. And actually, Minister Natalia talked about at least what has been said is all right. They support multilateralism, but look at Trump. Actually, even in the surface, he's denying. Is it just aberration or catalyst? I think I want you to talk about. And I introduced one question from YouTube audience. He said, isn't it true that the weakening of the multilateralism has been caused due to negative effects that exist along with the positive effect? This is question to Professor Eikenberry. It seems that we would need a new form of multilateralism for multilateralism to be renewed. And to Professor Acharya, you're a champion of the coining multiplex. And actually, Professor Choi talked about another type of multiplex, alliance type. They lead the world, but complemented by multilateralism we are talking about. Is it good combination for future of multilateralism? Finally, this domestic issues I'm very much interested in. And one of the panelists talked about this, bad effect of domestic politics. And we are facing, and every country are facing now, cost of audience inside domestic politics. And actually, and the blame game. A 2016 Oxford Dictionary Company, Oxford Dictionary, picked keyword of 2016, which was post-truth. So 2016 is Trump was elected and Great Britain exit from the EU. So not just domestic politics, what about this blame game can affect multilateralism in the future? Should we go in reverse order? Professor Barzell? You can pick whatever you want. So we have 24 minutes, probably 3-4 minutes at the most. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me try to address the question directly guided to me about different regional models, ASEAN and the EU, and they are very often contrasted as two opposite models of regionalism and whether they could be models for others. I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all. I think ASEAN, the European Union, the African Union, USMCA, those are different varieties of multilateralism at the regional level. And that brings me to the question whether regionalism is an alternative or as a sort of complementary to global multilateralism. I think these different models for multilateralism show different ways in how you can manage the negative consequences of what I would call liberal multilateralism, right? Economic, so free market, free trade, open markets on the one hand, and also liberal democracy on the other. And two challenges or negative consequences, if you want, are social inequality and climate change. And I think it is interesting to compare how these different varieties of multilateral regionalism cope in confronting, in coping with these negative consequences and in tackling global challenges more broadly speaking. And a second point I wanted to make with regard to regionalism, I think the cooperation between regions can be an important stepping stone for global multilateralism. And that allows me to address the last point, namely the role for the Republic of Korea. I think I have a bit of a problem of this dichotomy, the West versus the West, right? And the West being at the core of the multilateral international order, and the rest sort of contesting that. Well, it's historically it's flawed because as much as I recognize the leadership of the US, there was a lot of input from countries all over the world, Asia, but Latin America and Africa, in the building of the multilateral order. And I think this is important to keep in mind. And the Republic of Korea is a brilliant example that liberal democracy, it depends how you define the West, right? But it is a very important partner for the European Union in Asia, also when it comes to its cooperation with ASEAN. So I think we need these bridge-building countries all over the world to make regionalism and interregionalism work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Minister Natagawa, you're the next.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those questions. I just like to identify some of them, if I may, on the so-called ASEAN way. I think there was one specific question on that. I concur with the earlier statement that clearly there is no one size fits all. Each region's situation would be quite unique and not necessarily relevant and can simply be replicated elsewhere. But if there is one feature of ASEAN's regionalism, so to speak, or multilateralism at the regional level, the ASEAN way, I think the key feature would be its inclusive nature. Because there was a time when ASEAN, prior to its expansion to become ASEAN 10, when it was so-called ASEAN 5, it was easy to define. It was essentially supposedly pro-West, anti-East entity. And it would have been quite comfortable. You can have a conversation among converted, among like-minded, a nice, cozy club of similar outlook countries. But at the time, our leaders in Southeast Asia chose the different path. They chose a rather more difficult path, risking disunity within ASEAN by expanding ASEAN from 5 to 10, including countries of such diverse economic interests, political system, foreign policy outlook. However, in our case, our belief is that it's better to have everyone under a common tent. It is better to have divisions and different dynamics be channeled within this common regional home. But if we choose to be comfortable and to simply have like a guardian of who is in and who is out, then we can have a situation like, for instance, in other parts of the world where the region is perfectly dissected between one group of countries and another group of countries. So I think the ASEAN way, at the risk of oversimplification, reminds me of an inclusive multilateralism, notwithstanding different views, different outlook, different history, different economic system. We choose to align ourselves under one common tent with all its attendant problems in terms of disunity potentially, but all in all, it is better than to have differences resolved in other non-diplomatic ways. And as a result, ASEAN has become transformative. Relations between Southeast Asian countries now marked by more amity than enmity. Transformative in the sense of the place of Southeast Asian countries under challenge at the moment, admittedly, in the wider region is more secure in having centrality. Again, still to be earned, still to be waged, but better than it was before. And in terms of the economic benefits, imagine if ASEAN had remained the original ASEAN 5. We can prosper as a 5, but in our neighborhood, we have economies, countries in abject poverty. I don't think that will be good for the region's peace and stability, ultimately. Hence, it is better to have countries that are different system, different economic orientation to be under one common tent. I think the ASEAN way is instructive in reminding that diversity can be a source of strength rather than a source of weakness. On the second point on Korea, and there was specific reference to MIKTA, I'd like to underscore the previous comment. I see very much Korea's role within the multilateral setting as a bridge builder. I think Korea's influence will be far greater than if to be bridge builder and hence shaping and molding developments rather than becoming too predictable and obvious, labeling itself as belonging to one camp and then simply reinforcing that message over and over again. But if Korea in new emerging areas on green economy, green growth, sustainable development, progressive 21st century relevant issues, Korea put itself at the forefront, bridge building. I don't wish to use the term coalition building because again, it tends to be exclusive, but bridge building, I think, is the key term. Reference was made to MIKTA. I'm a little bit familiar with MIKTA's initiation. I must confess at the beginning, the idea of a middle power group was actually specifically mentioned This is within the G20, because the G20 there is the G7 within the G20, and then there is the BRICS countries, and there's the others who are not neither of those groups. And I remember in my conversation with these proponents, the idea of a middle power group was mentioned. And I was actually specifically the one who says, I don't agree with the idea of middle power. Why should countries as large as Indonesia, as large as the other countries within MICTA, self-contain, self-limits its ambitions and its possibilities by saying we're just going to be middle? The future is open to possibilities. So we describe ourselves, MICTA, simply by the name of the countries rather than trying to have some other defining label. But our mission to be influential within G20 is that we build bridges. We build bridges between the G7 and BRICS countries, and relevant dependent on the issue. And my final point is again on the domestic politics. I think ultimately, domestic dynamics. I think ultimately the greatest challenge to multilateralism is the erroneous suggestion as if there is a distinction between internal and external foreign policies. But our world, 21st century world, as the pandemic clearly suggests, is a world where local, national, regional, and global are perfectly enmeshed together. And hence, we have to deal with the reality that increasingly people are a little bit less patient. People want immediate results. Politicians make false promises that as if all the world's problems can be solved within a certain electoral cycle. We have to avoid contemporarism, short-termism. We need to have the patience to work at big issues for the long term rather than the next 2 years, 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think your points well taken. We have 14 minutes. We have 3 guests left. So limit your presentation to 3 minutes because we have a tight schedule of time. And Professor Acharya, you're next. Professor Acharya? Okay.
Okay. Unmuted now. So I would like to take 2 points, take up 2 questions. One directly addressed to me. How does alliance and multilateral combination reflect or relate to the idea of a multiplex world? I'd like to make this very clear. The idea of a multiplex world is not like coming out of a magician's hat. It actually reflects what's actually happening in the world. It's a very inductive principle or idea. So we have seen how global governance has changed and how US dominance of the international order has declined. And that's happening for structural reasons for a long time. And the multiplex simply relates to or conveys the idea of a post-hegemonic, pluralistic, and decentered world. And a key element of that is multilateralism, which is not going to disappear, but will be different. And I use the term G+. To me, what G+ means is 2 things. No single country is hegemonic and addressing or leading on every issue area. So we may have European Union providing leadership on climate change, as is South Korea. Maybe United States continue to provide leadership in many other areas, and in China increasingly providing leadership when it comes to infrastructure development. Country of Southeast Asia, people forget that we won't have a law of the sea without Asian countries. People like Tomiko, Hamilton, Amarsinge, Hashim Jalal, the Southeast Asians made the law of the sea the most important part of the rules-based order that is testing China possible. So that's my idea of a multiplex world and G+ leadership, and not anything that is I'm trying to create. I'm simply trying to reflect the changes that have happened in the world since World War II, since the end of the Second World War. On Korea, I had actually a few points, and I'll very quickly mention them because I think it's very important. One is Korea is a very attractive model of democracy and development and efficiency. Now, you can have a democracy, or you can have development, or you can have both and no efficiency. So we have had in Asia the stereotype that democracy and development don't go hand in hand. Lee Kuan Yew's old line. But now we see that some countries have broken that. India is democratic and development, but I must say it's not all that efficient. And Indonesia is under, at least since SPY after Suharto, is both democratic and developing very well, rising economy. But again, Indonesia, because of its size and some of the traditional ways of that still persist, is not doing the best job possible in managing COVID. I hope Pak Mati will agree with me. But Korea is democratic, development, and efficient at the same time. And the United States is democratic, maybe developed, very unequally developed. I don't think it's very efficient in dealing with COVID. So some places, countries like Korea or Hong Kong, to some extent territories like Hong Kong, Taiwan, and New Zealand, they provide kind of a model that we badly need in this world. The other thing about Korea is that Korea is, has leading on climate change, so issue-specific multilateralism in G20, very active role. So I don't know whether you use middle powers or not, but Korea can pick issue areas where it can actually provide leadership. And I have a PhD student. I have several Korean PhD students, one of them working on climate change policy of Korea. And she has demonstrated what an important job South Korea has done in addressing global climate change, a leadership role. And finally, regionalism. Korea was a pioneer in developing this idea of East Asian community. And at the regional level here, it's not a big power, whatever you call it, middle power, emerging power, but certainly played a very important role in developing the idea of East Asian community. So because of all these reasons, I think Korea, this is kind of a Korean moment. I actually call it the moment of not the great powers, but powers like Korea, New Zealand, or countries like Korea, New Zealand, and places, similar places around the world. We should give them much more space and highlight their achievement.
Professor Acharya, and next is Professor Che.
Yeah, I'd like to first talk about the Trump effect. I basically believe that he is an aberration in the history of foreign policy of the United States since World War II. Actually, there has been up and downs in multilateralism in the foreign policy of the United States. Usually, Democrats most strongly prefer multilateralism, while Republicans sometimes prefer unilateralism to multilateralism. Nonetheless, I think that most administrations up to the Obama administration actually pursued multilateral cooperation with other countries. I think that was basically those multilateral cooperation had been beneficial to the specific interests of the United States. But Trump made very different foreign policy decisions after he had taken power. And I basically believe that if Biden is elected in the next presidential election, I think he will return to the era of the Obama administration in basic sense, and in his engagement in the international institutions, and he will make great efforts to restore the American leadership in the international politics as well. And I believe that those kind of efforts will provide the world with a realistic alternative to leadership. I don't believe that other alternatives can be realistic in the present situation. I frankly believe that still United States has a pretty strong position in world politics, and it has the greatest influence in making it possible for many states to make collective action in many areas, in economics and in solving the problems in global commons. So I still believe that we can see a very different foreign policy of the United States if Biden is elected in the upcoming presidential election of the United States. And briefly about the role of Korea, I think the Korea should consider its policy on multilateralism in the context of its national security policy. I think that the fundamental strategic interest of Korea is to maintain the balance of power that can deter aggressors on Korean Peninsula and around the Korean Peninsula. So the good relationship with China is important. Nonetheless, I think that we should give priority to the alliance with the United States because it will be the key to keeping the balance of power with our own capabilities. So my one recommendation with regard to that kind of policy making, especially in economic area, is that we need to actively pursue the negotiation to join the CPTPP for strategic and economic reasons, especially if the next U.S. government moves to rejoin it. Nonetheless, I think that if the U.S. takes the initiative to build a new economic institution intended to exclude China from the global value chains, I think Korea may have to be pretty cautious about that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And then lastly, Professor Eikenberry, you're on.
Thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. It's been a multilateral conversation, and I think it's shown us the virtues of multilateralism in terms of ideas. I do think we have a lot of agreement here. I'll just say a word about American hegemony and Trump, and then about democracy. I think the Trump effect, I do think that we wouldn't be as worried about the future of the multilateral system if the United States were acting as it has in the past. I do think that Trump is the first time in 75 years where the U.S. is actively trying to undermine a liberal international order. And we have in the hands of one person the vast powers of the American presidency, both domestically and internationally. I think so the U.S. is kind of a wrecking ball, and this is new and different, but I don't think it's sustainable. And I think it's showing, if anything, that this alternative pathway for America is not a good one for America, certainly for the world, but not even for America. And so there will come a moment, I hope fairly soon, but at some point there'll come a moment when the forces on the other side of this debate about American foreign policy will have an opportunity. I agree with the other speakers that Biden would try to return us to a kind of tradition where America sees its own interests tied to building multilateral rules and institutions for mutual gain. That's the big secret of great power politics in the 20th century that the United States invented and profited from, creating soft power and creating friends and having the world want more rather than less American leadership. What other great power in world history has done that? But the United States doesn't seem to have remembered that. And one of the challenges after Trump goes is to try to find that pathway again. But even if the US returns, I think it's probably not likely it will be a good old days return kind of moment. It will be an opportunity for because of the reasons that Amitav has talked about, power transitions. There are more actors that matter, more things to do. So I think a more pluralistic cooperative order is inevitable if we're going to have multilateralism return. Middle states, South Korea, remember a global Korea, a kind of ideology of the middle state. And there's a lot of energy there for new alignments, new coalitions on lots of different issues. I hope the United States returns to playing a kind of leadership role. And if it does, then that will be a leverage effect. So that's all what I wanted to say about the Trump effect. Just finally on democracy, I do think where we have one difference here is how important is that as a coalition? And I would just simply say China and the United States do have very different agendas for the future, and the Western democracies, let's call them the liberal democracies, and China have different, what Jürgen Habermas called different modernity projects. One, it's capitalism without liberalism and without democracy, and the other one is a much more traditional approach tied to liberal democracy. And those are different values, and we're going to have a struggle for the next generation on that. And I think liberal democracies have to stand up and defend their values, and that includes in the international system. But they can do that in a smart, intelligent, enlightened way by defending their values while also reaching out for wider forms of cooperation. Thank you.
Much due to the scheduled time limit, I would like to wrap it up. I'm sorry for the poor management of time, and I wish I can get to you guys one more time, but and the audience is rarely actively ask questions. I'm sorry about that either too. And in Korean way these days it's called 끝장 토론. I wish this debate without ending, no ending debate. It's such a big project and big subject and too little time and too good panelists. So I wish we can have another time to talk about. And one thing before I wrap up this sessions, this COVID is not just test case for the multilateralism, as Dr. Barzell talked about. I think it's, in my opinion, a test case for the sustainability of the world community. Ironically and unintentionally, ultra connectivity created by LIO, Liberal International Order, laid highways through which COVID-19 can travel fast and spread widely. So natural response at first is lockdown, insulate, anarchic response. But in the end, we have to recuperate to some kind of mechanism. So I think that's why many panelists talked about the greatness of this liberal international order is self-correction ability. I think that is most important. Anyways, thank you for engaging actively in the panel discussions despite our physical distances. And thanks to all our global audience for your interest in the 2020 IFANS Conference on Global Affairs. Please join us again tomorrow for the second session of our conference, which will begin at 10 a.m. Korean time. Tomorrow's session will deal with the more specific topic of Korea's role in reinventing multilateralism in Korean, but English translation will be provided. I hope you all had a meaningful time listening and participating in our webinar, and we deeply appreciate your continued support and interest in our conference and KNDA. And most of all the staffs and members who are trying to set up this make it possible. Please enjoy the rest of your evening in Korea and other time in your country. Thank you very much. It's an honor to meet you and to have you. Stay well.